Welcome to Chapter 6 of the training videos for Matrix Games World in Flames. This chapter covers the main form, the informational forms, the screen layout lists, and the map view lists. Most of the time will be spent on the main form. I'll start with the standard drop-down menus, and then we'll get into the main form's various buttons and panels. Starting with the File drop-down menu, you have fairly common elements here. You can start a new game, restore a saved game, save a game under the current name, save it under a new name, change the autosave folder, close and exit the program. Nothing surprising there. Under the Command drop-down menu, the first item is to end the phase or subphase for the current major power. You can also do this using the keyboard with Shift-Enter. Notice that most of the menu items have keyboard commands that you can use. You can show valid moves for the current unit that you have selected. Primarily that's done during land movement. You can undo all. That again is used for movement, primarily during land movement and naval movement. You can find a city or port, find a sea area, and find a country. Let's go through those. Find a city and port brings up this list of all the cities and ports, and you'll notice there are a lot of A's, and when I go down another full page there are still more A's. When we drop down to the third page we finally get into some B's. If we click on an individual city like Aswan and say OK, the detailed map centers on Aswan in Egypt on the Nile. The Find Sea Area works in a similar manner. It lists all the sea areas. And when you select one like Cape Naturaliste and say OK, the map centers on Cape Naturaliste. Actually, it centers so that the 10 sea area section boxes are in the middle of the screen. Where is Cape Naturaliste? Well, Great Australian Bight and an island over here called Kangaroo should give you a pretty good idea where Cape Naturaliste is. The third search capability is for finding a country, and if we go down and click on Barbados, the map centers on Barbados in the Caribbean. The next item on the drop-down menu list is the distance calculator. This lets you find the distance between any two hexes on the map. For instance, if we want to know the distance from Berlin to Moscow, I'll bring up the Find Cities and type in BER for Berlin. That doesn't quite get the job done. So move down here, select Berlin, and then for the destination, we type in Moscow. I just need MOS for that. Try it again, MOS, and we get Moscow. So now we're finding the distance from Berlin to Moscow, and when you say calculate, it tells us that it's 26 hexes. If you go from a city to a sea area, for instance, let's try the Western Med, West Coast, Western Mediterranean Sea. Okay. You can expand this form so we can actually see what the name is. So we're finding the distance from Berlin to the Western Med. What it's actually doing is it's finding the closest hex to Berlin that's in the Western Mediterranean Sea. That's an all-sea hex. So the Western Med has a lot of sea hexes. It's finding the closest one. And this time I want to click on calculate the air distance too. And it says that it's 13 hexes. However, since the air distance has to go around neutral countries, and we're still at the beginning of the war and almost all the countries in the game are neutral, the only way to get there is to fly over a neutral, so the distance is prohibitively large, 138 hexes. There are no units in the game that can fly that far, so essentially it's saying that you can't get there from here. The last menu item here is Disable Phases. This enables you to save some keystrokes while you're playing the game. For instance, there are some major powers that are very unlikely to do port attacks. China, for instance, has very few air units and is unlikely to risk their air force trying to take out Japanese ships in some harbor. Click on China and skip port attacks. When that phase comes around, China will never do any port attacks. They also are unlikely to do naval air. And they're unlikely to do strategic bombing since their air units are unable to reach Japan, but they are likely to do carpet bombing and ground strike, and maybe some emergency HQ supply. So this is done by each major power, and you click on these major powers, and then you can click on the check boxes to decide which ones you want to skip. The third panel shows another set of phases. These are the air missions. Port attack, strategic bombing, carpet bombing, and so on are the 8 air missions. Air missions have a subphase called CAP, Combat Air Patrol. Combat Air Patrol is rarely used, and so therefore most players just want to skip this phase. So you can click on Skip All CAP Phases, and they're all checked immediately. So the United States is never going to fly CAP. If you go to the Commonwealth, you can also say Skip All CAP Phases. And you can do this for each country in turn. Or you can undo that. You can also save these as defaults and restore an existing default. So once you've set these for how you like to play the game, you can just go to this menu item and say restore the new game defaults, restore a new game defaults, and you'll get what you have saved previously. The main advantage in checking these boxes is that when you get to these phases later in the game, you're not required to click on the end of phase button up here again and again and again. If you change your mind later and decide that you do want to have these phases or these CAP phases be part of the game as you're playing, just go back to this page and uncheck the box. Moving on to Info. Now the Info drop-down menu has a lot of really good stuff, and I'll be spending some time here. The sequence of play. When you click on that, it brings up the sequence of play. On the left are the stages. These do not change. The center column changes depending upon what stage you're in. So we're in the land stage, so we're seeing land movement and land combat. And within the land movement group, there are 6 phases: rail, land, air transport, debark, and so on. Right now, because the flag is lit next to land moves, and it's Commonwealth, what we're doing is the Commonwealth land moves during the land movement group, during the land stage. If you want to know what these phases are about, you just right-click on them, and it brings up a short description. So the rail movement, the phasing side is the only group that can do rail moves, and they cannot do them if they've taken a pass or a naval action, and so on. So the sequence of play menu not only tells you where you are, it enables you to bring up help messages describing each phase in the game. The second menu item under Info is Initiative Impulse. This box shows you the current initiative track, and the arrow points to Axis +2. The other 4 possibilities are Axis +1, 0, Allies +1, and +2. On these, the +2 means how much is going to be added to the Axis die roll to see whether they win the initiative. And if any of the top 3 items are up, the Axis is going to be able to ask for a re-roll if they lose the die roll contest. Likewise, the Allies can ask for a re-roll if the initiative track is on 0, +1 Allies or +2 Allies. And that's what the re-roll buttons over here are all about. The other major section in this form is the impulse track. The current impulse here is 8. Axis is the phasing side. And if we go down here and look at an 8, we see a 2 will end the turn. So if a die roll of 1 or 2 is made at the end of the impulse, then the turn will end and we'll go on to the next turn. So the chance of ending the turn is 20% right now. Moving along to the weather report. This is fairly standard stuff. It lists all of the weather zones and what the current weather is in each of them. It tells you the modifier for the die roll on the next weather roll, and it tells you how much the impulse is going to advance by at the end of each impulse. And it also gives you the probabilities for what the weather will be on the next weather roll for each of the weather zones. So you can see here that there's a 90% chance of the weather being fine in the South Temperate, and there's a 40% chance of you having a storm in the North Monsoon. So this form is just informative. It tells you where you currently are with the weather and where you are likely to go. The activities available form. This form brings up the activities that are available for each of the major powers on the Allied side, because the Allies are the phasing side. So you can see what each of them have chosen as their action types, and how many land moves, rail moves, naval moves, etc. are currently available for them. The pools form has a lot of information. It has all these off-map pools that are listed over here in the bottom left. The off-map pools are units that are either going to be arriving on the map soon, such as these first 6, which are all reinforcements coming in on the 6 different turns of the year, and other off-map pools, which I'll describe in a minute. Right now, we are in the September-October turn. Reinforcements come in at the beginning of the turn, so the next set of reinforcements will be arriving in November-December. And that is what we're seeing here. There are the US, there are Japanese, some Netherlands, a lot of German units, some Belgians. There's even a Denmark unit in Copenhagen. There are some Italians, some Poles, and some Commonwealth units. If we look at the first one, it's the US cruiser Houston. It's in its second cycle, which means that starting at the beginning of the next turn, November, December, this will arrive and can be placed on the map. It has completed 2 build cycles. The submarine, on the other hand, is just going to be completing its first cycle. So in order to build it, it will have to go into the construction pool and be built for the second cycle. The carrier likewise and the submarine for the Japanese are also in their first cycle, and they will not arrive until they have been built a second time. For the carrier, what that means is that it will arrive November, December, having completed its first cycle. If the Japanese immediately build it, then it will arrive in 1940 in November, December, having completed its second cycle, and can then be placed on the map. A number of these major powers have pilots coming in. Germans would assign this pilot to this plane in most likelihood. The Italians would assign their pilot to their plane. The Commonwealth would have to choose which of these 2 planes they have built to get the pilot. If we go to the other turns, in January, February, these are the reinforcements. A couple offensive ships are coming in. In March, April, May, June, July, August, and there are none for September, October because those have all just arrived. The construction pool has naval units that have been built through their first cycle, and they need to be placed into the production a second time before they can come onto the map. The Japanese already have one carrier that's completed its first cycle, and they'd probably want to build this one so that they have it next year. The repair pool has some naval units that have been damaged, and the US would probably like to repair this carrier. The reserve pool is quite large. There are air units here, and you can see that the US has 8 air units. These have already been built, but they do not have pilots assigned to them. So they're sitting in the air reserve waiting for the US to build pilots. The units with Rs are reserve units that enter the game when the major power goes to war. The US is neutral right now, so they have a number of R units sitting out here. The V units are city-based volunteers, and that's a special rule that you can investigate to find out when they appear on the map. Let's filter this to just look at the USSR units. So here's what the USSR has in the reserve pool. They have 6 planes. They have a number of R units. If you'll notice, they have different types of R units. For instance, this cavalry here, when we go down and look at it, its year is listed as reserve, which means that as soon as the USSR goes to war, this unit is going to be placed on the map. But the infantry over here, 7-4, has as its year Germany. And what that means is that if the USSR goes to war with Germany, it becomes available. But if, say, the USSR is just at war with Japan, then this unit remains in the reserve pool. The internment pool looks to be empty here, but that's because I have the filter set. When I clear the filter, we'll see that there are 2 Polish air units here that fled Poland when it was being overrun by the Germans. And because they have fled, they are now in the internment pool. The pilots from these 2 air units will become available for the Commonwealth. The conquered pool has all of the units from Ethiopia. At the beginning of the game, Ethiopia has been conquered by the Italians. The destroyed pool is empty right now. This lists all of the units that have been destroyed during the current turn. So as units get destroyed through combat and other matters, they will appear here. At the end of the turn, this pool will be emptied, and some of those units will go into the scrap pool. If the player chooses to scrap a unit, then this is where it ends up. These are obsolete units, and you can see that they're pretty pathetic. A fighter with a strength of air-to-air 2. I'll come back to force pools. Let's look at the breakdown pool. The breakdown pool shows you core size units that have been broken down into divisions. The Lend-Lease pool shows you units that you might be able to persuade another major power to lend-lease to you. So for instance, this Boston 1 unit is a French unit, but it's actually sourced from the United States. So if the French can persuade the United States to give them the Boston 1 bomber, what will happen is this unit will go into the force pools for the French, and a comparable unit will be removed from the force pools for the US. And the French would probably like to have this unit because it has a tactical of 3 and a range of 9, which is better than the ones that they have currently. Getting back to force pools, why don't we look at what the French have? Here's the French force pool. These are all the units that they can build, and they have some bombers out here with a range of 3 and 9, so that one would be comparable. But these are expensive ones. If you look at the costs down here, as I scroll over the units, you'll see that the units have a range of 9 are considered strategic bombers, and so they cost 4 and take 4 turns to build. They already have lend-leased a fighter from the United States, which is the Hawk 75A sitting up here. The French have a lot of territorial units, and these are all in different countries. If they build these, then they will come in whatever country they're assigned to. The units for production are chosen randomly, so if France builds a territorial unit, it could come in Syria or Algeria or in Morocco, down in Senegal, out in the French Sudan. It's the luck of the draw as to where your territorial units come in. If we look at another country like Belgium, they have a few units out in the force pool that they can build. They would actually be built by the French because I believe in this game Belgium is aligned to the French. If we look at Bulgaria, they have only a couple units. Most of the minor countries have small numbers of units. Chile has a fairly good navy out here, surprisingly. So does Argentina. Argentina has 8 naval units that would be built if Argentina entered the war. The major powers have a lot of units to build. So if we look at Japan, here are all the air units that are currently available, plus all the carrier air units, and a few naval units, including a captured Chinese unit. They also have a number of land units. These are the ones that are currently in their force pool. All the major powers will get additional units added to their force pool at the beginning of the year. That is the January-February turn. If I click on this button down here, Show Build Ahead Force Pool, you will see all the units Japan will receive during the years of the war, and there are a lot of these. We can go out and set the filter, so we could just look at the ones that Japan is going to receive in 1940. So come January, February 1940, Japan will receive a number of air units added to their force pool. They don't arrive on the map unless Japan builds them. They'll have a few more naval units, mostly amphibious and transports, and they will also get a handful of infantry units. Most important is probably this Marine unit. If I clear the filter and then go out and look at, for instance, Germany. Germany has a lot of units currently available for production. Of all the air units they have available, the most interesting is the Stuka with a tactical of 5, and the air transports, which are capable of carrying paratroopers. So this pools form shows you all the off-map pools, what's coming in on the various turns throughout the year, what's currently sitting in the construction pool available for building, repair pool, the reserve pool, and so on. It's used a lot during the game in order to stay current with where things are and what's likely to happen in the near future. The next item on the drop-down list for info is the Lend-Leased air units. We saw part of these before looking at the pools form. This shows you all of the Lend-Leased air units for the Allied side, since we're the Allied player currently. Units in the game is another cut on similar to the pools form, but this includes all the units in the game. in particular those that are on the map, such as F2A Buffalo sitting currently in San Diego, or the P40C currently sitting in Honolulu, Hawaii. You might notice that the map updates as I click on different units that are on the map. The insert map centers on that unit. If we look at this P40C, here is the largest image of it. We also have all the details on it, that it comes in 1939, how much it costs, how many turns. It's currently disorganized and it's sitting in Honolulu being supplied by Nimitz. Here's a write-up on that Curtiss P40C Tomahawk. Most of the units in the game have write-ups. All of the air units do. So if you wanted to look at the P63C King Cobra, here's a write-up on it showing what its engines and weaponry are. The United States has a lot of units. We're looking at air units. I'm paging down here. There's still more and more. We're now into the carrier air units that can go on U.S. carriers. And there's a lot of those. And more and more and more. The naval air units, the tactical bombers, and then followed by the strategic bombers, the ATRs, air transports. And now we're into the ships. So the units in the game form lets you look and find all the units in the game. Those that are in future force pools, those that are currently on the map, those that are in reserve. So if you wanted to, we can modify this filter to just look at units that are on the map and just look at land units that are on the map. So we see that the United States only has a half a dozen land units on the map. A couple in New York, one in Manila, one in Honolulu. The Japanese have almost all of their units in China somewhere. And as you click on these, there's some in Japan as well. The map's into update showing you where they are. So the units in review form enables you to focus in on any selected group of units. Partisans form is another item that's available from the drop-down menu. It shows you all of the countries that might get partisans at the end of this turn and the probabilities of them coming in. It also shows you the garrisons levels and how many partisans are currently on the map. There's 0 to start with. The only important number over here is this 10% chance of one partisan arriving in India. So the Commonwealth might want to up its garrison count from 1 to 2 or 3 in order to reduce that number. There is production planning, and this form is one of the most complicated in the game. I'll spend a little time here on this form, but there's an entire tutorial devoted to production planning and production itself. So I'll just hit the high points here. The top of the form has a summary page. Underneath that are listed all of the different resources and factories that the current major power has. We're looking at the Commonwealth. You've got flags on the left for the Axis and flags on the right for the Allies. And if you click on these, it changes which major power is being presented. So Germany has this many factories producing, this many resources producing, and here are the actual lists of resources. If we scan down, underneath the resources are the factories themselves. Let's take a look at Italy, and I'll go through this summary form in detail. Italy has 11 controlled factories, 6 of them are idle, 5 of them are producing. On their oil resources, they're getting 1 in trade, and they're using 1 in production. If they want to reorganize units, it's going to cost them less than half of an oil point. If you spend less than half, then you don't spend any at all. But if you spend 0.50, then an oil point is consumed. They have 4 non-oil resources, one of which is coming in via overseas. It's convoyed overseas. So they have 4 in production from non-oil, 1 oil, which gives them 5 in production, which is why 5 of their factories are producing and the other 6 are idle. This gives them 5 production points before strat bombing. There's no strategic bombing, so they still have 5 net. Their production multiple is a half, so a half times 5 is 2.5, which rounds up to 3 build points. So at the end of this turn, they're going to have 3 build points, which will be available for them to build units with. They have 1 saved oil point, which they're keeping. They have 7 convoys on the map, but 6 of them aren't doing anything. Only one convoy is doing anything, and that's the one that's conveying the non-oil resource. We can look at the individual items here. So this is a non-oil resource that's in Pola, which is shown on the detailed map underneath. It's being used by the factory in Trieste, which is right next door. This non-oil resource just south of Florence is being sent to Rome, which is only 2 hexes away. The oil resource that's coming in through trade, which is what the TR means, from Ploesti, is being used in Taranto. So one of these 3 oil points in Ploesti is flowing over rail, and it ends up in Taranto's factory and is used in production by the Italians. And the Italians have one factory producing in Trieste. Only one of their 2 factories in Turin is being productive. Milan is all idle, so is Genoa, so is Naples. So if they get more resource points from, say, Germany, then they would be able to have more of their factories produce, they would have more production points, and they would get an additional half build point for each one of their production points, and they would be able to build more units. Let's look at the Commonwealth. They have 22 factories, 21 are producing. They control 7 oil points, they control 22 non-oil. They have 3 oil points in production and 18 non-oil points in production, giving them 21 production points, and their multiple is a half, so they have 10.5 rounded up to 11 build points available. They have 93 convoys, 36 are unused. So why don't we look at some of these resources and how they're being convoyed. So for instance, in London, we're getting a resource from Cyprus, and that resource from Cyprus is requiring 4 convoys. If we click on this 4 number, the maps change underneath, and it's a global map that shows you the route for the Cyprus resource. It starts in the Eastern Med, Western Med, St. Vincent, and up the Bay of Biscay, and it arrives in London. The more detailed information is over here. You can see that it actually arrives in the port of Liverpool and then goes by rail to London. London is getting other resources besides the one from Cyprus. If we go down here, we see that London is getting one from India. We can see that the India resource is conveyed first to the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and then follows the same path that the other one did. And the third resource that London is getting is also from India and uses the same route. This is all the route layout. If we go back to the summary, this is where we started. And we can go down here at the factories, and we can see that London has 3 factories and they're all producing. On the global map, the green are factories, and the other colors indicate non-oil and oil resources. The oil resources are in lavender, and the non-oil resources are in a brown. So you can see the Commonwealth has a lot of factories in London, and they have a group of resources in Canada that will be sent overseas to London. We can switch back to the detailed map. The only other thing that I want to touch on here is the non-owned resources. So when I click on this, it's showing all the resources that are uncontrolled, and there are quite a few of these. If I go to the expanded view, you'll see all the different locations for the resources which currently are unowned by anyone. There's a lot more that can be done with this form. All of these buttons down here in the left corner enable you to filter the various lists and also to give instructions as to where you want resources to go, which ones you want to save, and so on. But for now, I just want you to know that this form exists, and it lets you track everybody's resources and where they're going and how they're being used. The next item on info is something that's fairly simple, the strategic bombing. It shows you what damage has been inflicted by strategic bombing on oil points and on resources. Right now there's none because no strategic bombing has been done, so the only numbers that have something here are the amount of oil that's going to be needed by the various major powers in order to reorganize their units at the end of the turn, and how much oil they currently have saved. That's the Axis side, and here's that same information for the Allied side. Supply sources and routes gives you an overview of all the sources of supply for your units and which ones are actually being used. Here we see the Commonwealth. and all of their secondary supply sources. The ones that have numbers are indicating that there are units being supplied. So if we look at Wavell, we'll see that he has 2 units supplied, one of which is himself, and the other is a armored unit. These are currently located in Egypt, and Wavell's source of supply, he's in range, so the number of basic hexes in his supply path has to be kept down to 2. But that's not a problem because he just goes to the Eastern Med, and then to the Western Med, Cape St. Vincent, Bay of Biscay, and he can draw down supply from the primary supply source, Liverpool. Gort, on the other hand, is just over in France. He's supplying the British Expeditionary Force there, which are 2 motorized infantry units, plus himself. And his source of supply is via the North Sea to Plymouth, which isn't a city, so it then goes by rail to Southampton. We can limit this to just the active ones, and we can see that in Aden there are a whole lot of naval units that are receiving supply. Aden itself is getting supply via the Arabian Sea to Bombay, adding the primary supply sources besides the secondary. And you can see that the primary supply sources are in the United Kingdom. There's also Canada is supplying some units there. Delhi has a unit, as well as Calcutta and Bombay. There are supply sources from South Africa and from Sydney. And then we're back to the secondary supply sources. This form lets you see each of the major powers, where they're getting supply from. You can also find which units are out of supply. So if we go to OSS, out of supply units, there aren't any units down here at the bottom, but some of the supply sources, capitals of minor countries, are unable to trace to a primary. Nyasaland capital is unable to find a primary, so is the Tanganyika, Kenya, and Uganda. Even the British Honduras is unable to trace a supply to a primary supply source. If we go to the USSR and look at out-of-supply units, there actually is one, and we can find him on the map. The capital of Mongolia is in the middle of nowhere with no rail line, so it's unable to trace to a primary supply source either. You're also able to look at minor countries, and if we go out here and check, say, Libya, what we'll see are the primary supply sources for Libya. It's aligned to Italy, so it has all the Italian supply sources available. But in addition, it also has the capital of Libya, Tripoli, is also available as a primary supply source for Libyan units. And there is a Libyan unit that is using that supply. It's this one here, and you can trace the individual unit supply. He's on the border of Tunisia, and he just traces 2 hexes to Tripoli. This form is useful for keeping track of where your units are in and out of supply, and also those of your opponent. U.S. entry options, there's 1 page devoted for these, which gives you the entry level on the left, whether the option has already been chosen, what the option is, and also the target for this option, whether it's aimed at Japan, Germany, Italy, or all 3 Axis major powers. The prerequisites and the effect on tension. Over on the right is the current status for entry levels. You can get more information on the entry status by using a different form. So if I say done here, the second item on the US is US entry pools, and this shows you the actual chits and the current entry level and tension level for both Germany, Italy, and Japan. If you were the Axis player and you were looking at this form, instead of numbers you would have a whole bunch of X's up here and you wouldn't get the totals at all. The third item in the US entry is the US entry actions. These are actions that the players can take during the war that have an effect on US entry. So if Japan occupies French Indochina, then there's the possibility of the entry chits and the US pool for Japan having more chits added to it. The 12 indicates that 1, that's the 10, will definitely be added, and there's a 20% chance of a second chit being added. If China actually gets conquered, then there are 3 chits that will definitely be added to the Japanese pool for the US entry. and there is a 50% chance of there being a fourth chip added. The number of U.S. entry actions are quite large. If you go all the way down to the bottom, there are 55 of them. So you can get info on the U.S. entry options, the pools, and the actions. You can also get the international relations between the major powers and all the minor countries. Here are the three Axis major powers, and running on a list down the right-hand side are all the minor countries and what the current status is. You can see that Germany is at war with a lot of countries, and that's because it's at war with the Commonwealth and France. So it's at war with, say, Senegal, because Senegal is aligned to France. And it's at war with Tanganyika because Tanganyika is aligned to the Commonwealth. The other major powers on the Axis side, Japan is at war with China. You can see that Italy has aligned Eritrea. And if we go down, we'll see that they've also aligned Libya. If you go over to the Allied relations, you will find that China is just at war with Japan, the Commonwealth and France are only at war with Germany, and the United States and the USSR are neutral. This form gives you an overview of all of the international relations between the major power, the other major powers, and also all the minor countries. Trade agreements are fairly simple. Germany is lending, actually giving, the USSR 2 build points every turn. In compensation, if we go down here, we'll see that the USSR is sending to Germany 6 resources, 2 of which are oil. Neutrality pacts, there's only one in existence. Germany and the USSR have a neutrality pact. This shows you what the garrison levels are on each side, and also the possibility of breaking the pact. Captured facilities, there aren't any this early in the war, but as ports get captured, they would show up. Victory totals. This form shows all 67 objective hexes, victory hexes on the map, and who currently controls them. There's a summary at the top telling us that the Commonwealth is currently leading. They have 20 victory points. Germany is in second place with 11.5. And you might ask, where's that 11.5 come from? So if we go over here and look at the sorted list by major power, here are the 11, and this white one is the half. What happens is Helsinki is neutral, and therefore its objective hex is awarded to whichever capital on the other side is closest. And it just so happens that Helsinki is equidistant from Berlin and Moscow, and so therefore Germany gets half a point and the USSR gets half a point. You can see that China doesn't have very much right here. They just have Chongqing. Italy has 6, and so does France. So if you're wondering how you're doing during the game, just bring up the victory form. The last item on the info list is the optional rules, and here are a list of all the optional rules and their current status, whether they're on or not. Most of these optional rules are on. The one without the word on after it, such as construction engineers, means that it's off. If you want to know what carrier planes is, you just click on this optional rule, and the player's manual section describing carrier planes comes up, so you can do a quick review of what's involved with carrier planes. So look up those that are off, such as the Blitz bonus. Even though it's off, you're still able to review it if you want to. That concludes the info drop-down menu. There was a lot there. For view, these are mostly for affecting the detailed map. For view, you can turn the global map on and off. You can turn on and off the units and hex panel. You can zoom in and out. I'll do that in a minute using other tools. You can go through the selectable units, cycling through them one at a time. You can also look at the screen layouts list and the map views list and a number of controls. All of these are available on the main form under the buttons and panels, so I'll cover those when I get to that and skip over this right now. The interface lets you bring up this panel with some options for how the game behaves. So you can cycle through next units automatically. You can automate saving games at the beginning of each phase. You can get prompted at the end of each phase to make sure you don't end it when you didn't mean to. You also have some visual, video, and sound effects. and the ability to set die rolls. That's only available if you're playing solitaire. At the bottom of this form, it shows you how the program is viewing your monitors. In this case, there are two monitors, and it has the one on the left and another one of the same size on the right. Windows doesn't have very much. Mostly you would use it to create a second detailed map, or a third, or a fourth. I'll show you a form in a minute where there are 10 detailed maps. The help menu is one that you'll be using a lot. The top 4 selections under the help menu are all PDF files. For the player's manual, rules as coded, rules as written, the original rules from Australia Design Group, and the Australian Design Group scenarios booklet. All of these bring up Adobe Acrobat and a PDF file which you can examine. The others on this list are game-specific forms, such as the keyboard and mouse form. This shows you 3 pages. The first 2 pages are on the different things that you can do for picking up and moving units, other mouse clicks for accessing the units menu, and the last page in this are all the keyboard commands, all the shortcuts that you can take in order to have various forms come up. So if you do a Control-I, you get to see the initiative impulse. If you do a Control-O, you'll see the optional rules. If you do a Control-V, you'll be able to see the victory totals. So these are all the shortcut keyboard commands. Another help thing that you will use from time to time when you're beginning play is the terrain effects chart. And this shows you the terrain. The next page shows you the hexsides, and the third shows you the icons. The last page here are all the notes, which describe the 3 previous pages. Besides terrain, you can also look at the information help panel for units numbers. So this is the land units, and here are all the NATO symbols and what the NATO symbols represent. They also have the unit size indicators explained. The second page shows you more land units, and then you're into some of the special units. Third in this group are the naval units. Again, here's all the abbreviations and what they mean and what all the numbers are about. And then there are a couple pages for the air units. Here are the silhouettes and what they indicate in terms of fighter, land bomber, naval bomber, etc., and what all the numbers mean, as well as the special coloring for night fighters and twin engines. And the last page is also showing you more of the special symbols: may not paradrop, air transport capability, large air transport, and so on. In addition to the numbers, you can also bring up the unit status indicators. The status indicators are the little dots that are above the unit depictions on the map and also running down the left-hand side. If none of these dots are lit, then the unit's basically in good shape. But if the dots come up, then there's something special about him. The green dot in the upper left means that it's available for movement. This orange dot here in the second position, if you see that, the unit is disorganized. This dot on the right-hand side is a supply status, and it's either out of supply, isolated, and the headquarters units will show that it's a primary, secondary, or an emergency supply source. If you don't see any dot, then the unit's in supply and there's no problems. When you need to know what the status indicators are, this page is available to explain them all. We also have a summary page for units, cost, and turns, and this just goes through the various unit types and how much they cost and how many turns it takes for them to arrive on the map during production. We're then into combat results tables, which can be brought up here. Here's the air-to-air combat. Here are the various die rolls. And down the right-hand side are the percentage of the time that you will roll that die. So an 11 is the most likely result when you're rolling 2 dice and adding them, and that occurs 10% of the time. There's also some other explanations down at the bottom here for what all the letter codes mean. Anti-aircraft works the same way. The tricky bit about this is that the numbers here then need to be translated. So a 1-1 here means you roll 1 die and you take the highest one. A -1-2 means that you roll 2 dice and you take the lowest one. A -1, 3 is 3 dice, and the negative sign means you take the lowest. Over here in the lower right is a translation of what these actually will result in. A -1, 3 has a range of from 1 to 10. Its mode most likely is a 1, and the mean is 3, with a standard deviation of 1.93 for those of you who are really interested in numbers. We also have the Naval Combat Results Table showing the various air-to-sea, sub and anti-submarine warfare and surface combat types, and how many enemy ships and what all the values are for those situations of 17 to 20 air-to-sea points being against 3 to 4 ships. You get 2x a D and 2A, which means 2 destroyed, 1 damaged, and 2 aborted. We also have anti-submarine warfare attacks, and again, this are shown as lowest and highest of a certain number of die rolls, and here's the probabilities similar to the ones that were shown on the other page that I just did. You can also bring up the charts from the board game. This is a PDF, and it'll let you examine what Australian Design Group has as their charts. These are redundant. This covers the same information as the others that were just shown above. But some of you might be very used to using those and find them more convenient. You can go out to the picture and text tutorials. All 10 of these are available, and if you click on one of these, it brings up the tutorial, and you can jump to any of the pages that you want within each tutorial. So if you want a quick refresher on the supply rules or a quick refresher on the sequence of play, you can go out to the picture and text tutorials using the help menu. The other items down here at the bottom are not used all that often. You can check for a new version of the program. You can bring up the discussion group at Matrix or at Yahoo. You can ask about the current game. What the current game shows you is the saved file, the version you're running under, the scenario, and other pertinent information. It's mostly used for, if you save the game, what the saved game file will have as its information section. You can ask about the program, and this is fairly standard. It shows you all the people that helped create the game. That concludes the drop-down menus. Now I want to run through the various buttons and the flags and these panels. These 8 buttons over here relate to the detailed map. So we have railroads, labels, weather zones, units, unit resolution, weather overlays, and hex control. If you click on the railroads, all the railroads disappear from the map. You click on it again, and they're back. If you click on the letters, all the labels disappear from the map. A second time they come back. Weather zones brings up these small labels within each hex. The NT represents Northern Temperate Weather Zone. And if we scroll down here a little farther, we'll see that there's MD, Mediterranean Weather Zone, below this white line. Clicking on the weather zones turns them off. You can also make all the units disappear from the map and bring them back. You have the ability to change how the units are shown. In this case, it's a high resolution, and if we click on this, it'll go to medium resolution. And what's happened are the names and some of the other detailed information has disappeared, but the numbers and the symbols have become larger. So if you look at the 7.3, when I go back to high resolution, we now have the name for it, but the number 7.3 are smaller. Other changes that happen at medium resolution are you just get the symbols for the air units. This is an air transport, this is a fighter, this is a naval air, this is a tactical bomber. Most of the time you'll want to be using high resolution, especially if your zoom level is at 5 or higher. So for instance, I go up to 6, to 7, and the maximum 8. The high resolution's fairly nice. But if we go down to 3, it's hard to read some of these numbers. And at that point, going to medium resolution makes it easier to examine this line and understand what the values are for the various forces that are opposing each other. I'll go back using the zoom bar here. You can drag this to whatever the resolution that you like. I'll go back to 6 here. The other items that you have are overlays for weather, and when I click on this, we can see that it's raining, and click on it again and it removes that overlay. It's still raining, but you just don't have the weather overlay being displayed. Let's leave the weather overlay on. The flag shows you who controls each hex. So this brings up the Commonwealth flags in England because the Commonwealth controls those. France controls France. And I want to show you what's going on in here. So I'm going to turn off the weather overlays. I'm going to remove the units. I'm going to get rid of the various other items and let you see the map where the flags are the dominant feature. Germany controls this portion of Belgium, but these two hexes are controlled by France. The slash here indicates that it's an aligned minor country. So this hex is controlled by France, it's France itself. This is just Belgian hexes which are aligned to France. These are also Belgian hexes aligned to France. And now we're back to where we were before. The other items up here next to the 8 map controls are 2 arrows which let you cycle through your units. So when I click on right, it goes forward through the units. We're in the land movement phase for the Commonwealth, so we jump to a Commonwealth land unit in Egypt that's able to move at this time. When I click on the red arrow again, this unit over here flickered to let us know that he was able to move. The next time we jump to a unit that's in Mombasa, and when we click again we end up in southern Rhodesia. These are all the land units that the Commonwealth can move at this time. We're in Bombay in India. We're in the Netherlands East Indies. The Commonwealth has the Netherlands aligned, so they move the Netherlands units. Here's a unit in Canada, and now we're back to England. And after we go through the English units that are in England proper, we will cycle through these 3 units that are currently in France. The left arrow just takes you backwards and goes through them in the other order. The flags are very important. They tell you who's making decisions during the current phase. So all of the Axis flags are disabled, which means they are not decision makers during this land movement phase. And all of the Allied flags are enabled, which means they are decision makers. We do not have to do the Commonwealth first. We could switch to China by clicking on the China flag. And we now are in the middle of China, and we can cycle through the Chinese units that are available for movement. We can see that it's raining in the North Temperate, and in the North Monsoon it's storm, very heavy rain. We can go back to France and look at the French units. They have a unit that is in New Caledonia that could move, but most of the French units that can move are in France proper on the front line against the Germans. This button here is the end of phase button. It's probably the button that you'll be clicking on the most during the game. As each major power ends its phase, you click on this button and it'll go to the next major power. When all major powers have completed their moves, then it'll go on to the next phase. The panels here describe the current hex. So right now they're blank because I have the cursor moving over them instead of over a hex. As I move the cursor down here to a hex, those buttons light up. It shows that it's rain in the North Temperate. And all of these hexes are rain in the North Temperate. When we go down here, it shows that it's rain in the Mediterranean. This is the activities. It's a land movement phase. The French player has 3 land moves available. If we go back to Great Britain, they also have 3 land moves available. If we click on this, we can see that the Commonwealth has 3 land moves and that the French also have 3 land moves. The Commonwealth took a combined, and the Commonwealth is the current major power as indicated by the flag. This line shows you that it's September, October 39. It's the 8th impulse of the Allied side is the phasing side, and it's the land movement phase. The panels down here and over to the right all relate to the cursor traversing the map. So if I go down here to Coventry, the panels above show that it's controlled by the Commonwealth. It's a clear hex. It has 1 factory, and its title is Coventry in the United Kingdom. It's not adjacent to any sea areas. If I move up to, say, Glasgow, we have Commonwealth clear. There are 2 factories. There's also a major port, and the blue line has come up showing that it's adjacent to the Faroes Gap. If I move over to Edinburgh, we now have it's a major port, there are no factories, and it's adjacent to the North Sea. However, it cannot be invaded from the North Sea. The same is true for London down here. It's adjacent to the North Sea, but no invasion is possible. So this blue line up here is very important for letting you understand which hexes can and cannot be invaded. I want to look at a couple hexes in Denmark to make that point a little stronger. Here's a hex that's in northern Germany next to Denmark, and it's adjacent to the Baltic Sea, but it cannot be invaded from the Baltic Sea because it does not have an all-sea hex sign. It's adjacent to the North Sea, and since there's no explanation behind it, it can be invaded from the North Sea. If we move to the hex just above it, we get the reverse. This one's adjacent to the Baltic and can be invaded. It's also adjacent to the North Sea, but it cannot be invaded. So if you're in doubt as to which hexes can and cannot be invaded from which sea areas, this blue line up here makes that crystal clear. Most of these panels up here also act as buttons. So if I click on the weather panel, it brings up the weather form. If I click on it a second time, it goes away. If I click on the weather zone, it brings up all the indicators in each hex telling us what the weather zone is. I click on it a second time, those go away. If I click on the number of land moves, I get the activities panel and I can make that go away. If I click on the control hex, it brings up the flags. If I click on the terrain, it brings up the terrain chart. And if I click on it a second time, it goes away. If I click on the icon map, it also brings up the terrain effects chart because that's where all the icons are presented. The last panel on the main form is this prompt and warning messages panel. This tells you where you currently are in the game and if you're trying to do something that's inappropriate. So for instance, if I click on this British unit and try to move it, and I go to move it at sea, I get a prompt that says you cannot move a land unit to a sea hex. If I try to move it to this hex, I'm told that it exceeds stacking limits because the British and the French do not cooperate. So even if I try to go over to this hex that has just one French unit, I'm not allowed to move there either. And if I try to go to the German unit, I'm told that I can't overrun the German unit from this hex. If I just move to join the 6-5 infantry, I get the helpful information that it costs 2 movement points out of 4 available, and that if I press the escape key, the unit will go back to where he was. This panel is very useful for providing feedback to you as you are moving your units. The one other section that I haven't described here is this large white panel in the upper right. This gives you a summary on individual units under the cursor or a hex under the cursor. So if I go back over this 6-5 infantry, it tells me it's the 11th motorized, and it tells me it's getting supply from Gort and the attack and defense strength. If I go to the 7-4, I get the same information, but except this is the 4th motorized. If I go to this German unit, there are 4 units in this hex, and I am told that there's 7 attack strength points, 14 defense strength points. These L's all indicate those are land factors. There are no air units because the air attack and defense strengths are all 0, and the naval side is also all 0. So this panel up here gives you information on individual units or a stack of units in a hex. In summary, this main form is very small. It's been squeezed down as small as we could make it, and yet it is loaded with information and capabilities for helping you play the game. It helps you work with the detailed map. It helps you see who's currently making decisions and what the various limitations on them are. And it has a slew of drop-down menus which enable you to acquire additional information on the game in progress. To conclude this tutorial, I want to cover the screen layouts list over here on the right and the map views list. I'll start with the map views. These are all labels that players have assigned to various map views. So if I click on the England button, this is what the player decided would be appropriate for viewing England. It shows them southern England. It has the weather effects turned on. It also has a zoom level of 4, and it centers somewhere around Coventry. If I click on the London button, this has a different zoom level. We're back up to 5. It still has the weather overlays on, but now it's centering somewhere around Amsterdam. If we go to northern England, this is bringing up Scapa Flow and Scotland, and also letting us look at the North Sea. We can jump over to Newfoundland, and here the zoom level has gone all the way out to 2, and this is primarily useful for seeing the units in the Canadian coast and also in the East Coast. We can go to the Solomon Islands in the Pacific. We can go to South Africa, Suez. These are all areas that are of interest to the Commonwealth player. He wants to keep an eye on the Western Med because of Gibraltar, and in fact sometimes he wants to look at Gibraltar in particular. We can zoom this in and say turn off the weather overlays, and then we go out with a right click and redefine this map view. It will now have the larger zoom level, and it will not have the weather. So if I jump back to London, we have this zoom level and this weather. And when I go to Gibraltar, I have a larger zoom level and no weather. I'll undo this. I'll turn the weather back on, and I'll take the zoom level down to 4. And now I'll go out to Gibraltar. I'll redefine the map view, and now it's back to the way it was before. These are the map views for England. If we switch to China, the China map views are completely different. They're interested in the Burma Road. Runs in here to Kunming and then continues on. We can also focus down on Canton, Hong Kong. We can look at central China as an overview, northern China as an overview, southern China. We can focus in on Wuhan. We can also focus on Kunming. This way we see the entire Burma Road running from Mandalay up to Kunming. The USSR has a completely different set of map views. Here we can look at the Black Sea. We can look at eastern Poland, focus in on Moscow or Leningrad, look at the Urals, jump over to eastern USSR, Vladivostok. Some of the map views for the USSR include Communist Chinese. So Xi'an is a Communist Chinese city, and the USSR gets to move the Communist Chinese units. So therefore, map views for Communist China are also included as part of the USSR's preferred map list. You can add and subtract these, you can modify them, change them. You can have as many or as few as you want. If you want to have 2, or if you want to have 20, that's entirely up to you as a player. And what I want to do now is change the screen layout. We've been looking at the training video chapter 6 screen layout, and I want to go to the sea areas screen layout. This screen layout is completely different. What we have is the main form, screen layouts and map views across the top. We have a global map in the upper left corner here, and then we have 10 detailed maps. The detailed maps correspond to the Atlantic. So I'll scroll the global map a little bit here to get it centered. And what I'll do is I'll turn on the convoys for the Commonwealth to show where all the convoys are. And what these map views correspond to are each one of the sea areas in the Atlantic. So the Faroes Gap is here, and then there's the North Atlantic and the East Coast and the Caribbean. The mouths of the Amazon is down here. The Central Atlantic is over here. And so what this screen layout lets the Commonwealth player do is see both his convoys and overview on the global map, but also all of the detailed information as to what units are actually in each of these C areas. And taking a quick glance here, we see convoys in all the C areas, but not very many other units. So the convoys are mostly unprotected. The ones in the Faroes Gap have a cruiser available for protection, and the ones in the North Sea have some protection, as do the convoys in the Bay of Biscay. But the rest of them are all very exposed and could theoretically be attacked by Germany. Let me go back to Training Video Screen Layout V6. Modifying the screen layout and the map views list is fairly easy. You just do a right click and it brings up a drop-down menu for deleting a map view, which just removes it from this list. It doesn't delete it from the disk. You can rename it, you can redefine it, you can save a new one. If you save a new one, you'll be asked for a new name. Restore an existing one that you had created earlier. The same thing applies to the screen layouts. You can restore one, you can save it, you can add a screen layout to the list, you can remove it from the list, and you can change the positions or the sequencing of the item. That concludes Chapter 6, covering the main form, screen layouts, map views, and all the different informational forms that are available from the main form drop-down menus.